it's impossible really to talk about without a very long-term interest that I've had in the genre of oral history. Oral history is a bit of a throwaway genre. It's compelling, it's entertaining, it's captivating, but often it's beach reading or bathroom reading. You dip in, you dip out. And I'm a long-term fan of it, particularly of the Gene Stein and George Plimpton oral histories. West of Eden, I think, was the name of it's such an awkward title. I can never quite get it right. Of Gene Stein's and Edie Sedgwick, etc. The Capote oral history, and then more recently the Mike Nichols one, and there's one on the director Robert Altman. There's many of them, and I became a kind of student of them because it had always been in my mind to write an imaginary oral history. And what the oral history is capable of is exemplified in the work of Svetlana Alexievich, who's the Russian writer that won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And her literature is nonfiction, which to me is a merging of the dream, the dream or the illusion of what is reality. There's a quote or an axiom among law enforcement and prosecuting attorneys that the eyewitness is the most fallible of all. So when you're reading oral histories, you have this fantasy that you're finally reading the absolute truth, which is as untrue as having that feeling when you're reading a biography. So I had experimented with that form, particularly in a book that I wrote called The Empty Chair, which was essentially two very long monologues, a kind of definitely an oral history, but a perverse one in that it had a cast of characters of two. And so I thought to be able to paint on a much larger canvas and have 400 voices, which I had, would be the challenge for me. And in terms of what you said about the covering a century, which is true. He dies at 80, but I do get into his lineage. I wanted to mimic the form of the oral history, which often begins with lineage and things that are not so interesting for the reader, but do serve a purpose, because ultimately the dramatic episodes to come, which in American oral histories are usually immense fame and stardom, followed by myriad hospitalizations for psychiatric illnesses, for physical ailments, followed by near-death experiences, followed by a resurgence of fame, the storied second and third acts, followed by either more anarchy or a kind of serenity, and then death. And so I wanted to sink deep into the form, and in that way, I was learning about Roger Orr almost at the same time the reader was, in terms of my process as a writer.
And I'm a fan of this genre too, and I've toyed around a little bit as a writer with I've always, that's kind of an idea that I've had, a fake oral history would be interesting, but I found it very challenging. You're limited. You're really constrained by that form in terms of, keeping readers oriented, keeping the story moving and coherent. Did you find yourself with a steep learning curve, or was it something that you had internalized enough that you kind of intuited your way through it?
Well, the human voice for me is almost paramount. So the speed with which I wrote this book came because a lot of the ligaments and connective tissue that are necessary in the writing of a novel were eliminated. They were deleted or erased. So I simply could glory in the vocalizations of the characters. And, I've compared it to the ketamine experience when you go down the K-hole. One of the things about ketamine is that if you're in a place that you are uncomfortable with, or a place that you are rhapsodic about, those things go away after a short period of time. With the metaphor of a many-roomed mansion with ketamine, it's the same with an oral history. You / the reader may not be particularly enthralled by the voice of someone, whether that person was a friend of Rogers, a critic, a lover, a sister, a brother, an enemy, but you are quickly on to the next voice. So that was something that helped me tremendously, but I was extremely challenged. I've compared it to climbing Everest because I think, at least my unconscious knew how impossible this task would be. And I thought at first I would do something more akin to Shouts and Murmurs in the New Yorker, an extended sort of parody of the form. But that same part of me, whether unconscious or not, knew that would be a cheat. That would be lazy, So I had to fool myself and tell myself that I was going to near the base camp of this mountaineering enterprise and just hang out there rather than try the ascent, But as I got deeper in, it became more apparent to me that I had to ascend. I had to reach the top of the peak, whether I was frostbitten or near death. And it became more imperative that I do that. And the other part of this is that at the end, Roger or American Master is a full-blown novel. And I did subvert the form at the end because I didn't want the reader to feel that I was doing a parody of the form. As complex and nuanced as this book is, one could still regard it that way if I ended traditionally, the funeral, and then a kind of poetic or quasi-poetic epilogue of various people that knew him making comments that are abstract and kind of we fade out. That would be the typical form of an oral history with an index. So of course I do not have an index because an index for me would have signaled parody of oral history form. So by the end, this book ends in a kind of, it breaks the fourth wall and becomes a kind of stream of consciousness and purely novelistic.
Were there particular challenges that you found in the work? Like you said something about speed. Did you write this quickly? Because it's a really sprawling book. It would be impressive if you wrote it fast.
I did, and it was rather agonizing. I did a kind of a trick. You've been doing this as long as I have. You make use of as many tricks that you've learned. And what I did is I divided the book into 5 books, each representing 15 years. And then there's a kind of epilogue. There's a prologue as well. But I felt that if each chapter of each of those books was 12 to 20 pages, I didn't want to go past a 20-page chapter. So this at least gave me something foundational that allowed me to proceed, because I think otherwise I would have been dead in the water. I would have been paralyzed. It was just too heroic a thing for me to attempt to do. And that was the biggest challenge. Obviously, what happens in each 15-year segment, each near generation, and then, of course, how to make everything tie together so the reader isn't just reading a kind of random potpourri of comments, which would have been closer to the lazier method of going for shouts and murmurs, and something that gave me the leeway of high comedy. Another thing that was great about this form is Stephen Fry pointed it out, because we did an audio book where we had 20 actors reading all of the parts of the book. And Stephen Fry said that this form somehow allowed me, which is something I knew, but until someone else made the observation, it didn't really come home. I was able to do high comedy, the blackest satire, next to very simple and poetic, demotic language, everyday language, and observations. There's a review of a book that Roger Orr wrote in this novel that I wrote, by Toni Morrison for the New York Times. It was read by Deborah Eisenberg, the writer, who's married to Wally Shawn. Wally is also in the book and reads himself in the audiobook. And it's enormously dense and complex. And then there's the groundskeeper at a cemetery, his remarks, which of course are polar opposite of hers. So that was a revelation to me, that I did not have to maintain a consistency of tone, that the form was very expansive and very generous. It would not affect the end result. So it would be as if I had written to use your word, a sprawling novel that was able to contain multitudes of not just voices, but of literary forms.
Yeah, it struck me as I was reading, like the couple of challenges that I imagine you faced were trying to differentiate the voices, since there are so many, to make each one distinct, so that they don't sound too much alike. And then as you're moving through the narrative, moving through the life story of Roger Orr, and the details pile up, I could imagine a revision process happening maybe in real time or after the fact, where you had to kind of go back and tie threads together because new things emerge as the story progresses. Did that happen, or is that not the case?
It didn't happen too much. I'm with my books. This book was published by Arcade, and it was the first time I worked with Arcade. And I told the editor I was working with, Lily Golden, that my method is that when I finish a manuscript, it's not going to be perfect, but it will be probably, even if it's a 500-page manuscript, plus or minus 3 pages, my corrections. But my corrections are within the body of the work, paragraphs, sentences, for felicity, for grace, thousands and thousands upon, maybe tens of thousands of changes. And I was true to my word, and she had forgotten, of course, by the time I turned the book in, the caveat, and was startled. But they were great at Arcade, and I would say only occasionally something goes south when you're halfway through or 3/4 of the way through that necessitates revisions earlier in the text. For the most part, no.
How long did it take you to write it?
I think, it's a difficult question because I would say that the bulk of this book was probably 90 days.
Wow.
Yeah. And that means, Brad, that waking up at sometimes 4:30 in the morning, working for a few hours at home, then going to a club that I like to work at, wearing compression socks because I was sitting for such long periods of time, coming home and perhaps working again, or just turning on Deadliest Catch or the Kardashians, just something to shut my head off. And it was really sustained. And that was, any writer that doesn't tell you that the actual writing of a book is nightmarish, I'm very suspect of, So, and it goes on and on. Once you finish, there's another 6 months of hardcore corrections, multiple full manuscript corrections. So it doesn't seem like it's going to have an end. And then seemingly it doesn't have an end, because there's always going to be typos. And but I'm not one that has regrets. I never turn a book in, even though I turn it in prematurely, that I don't feel in my heart and my gut isn't everything or close to everything that I wanted to do.
I'm going to read a quote of you talking about your own work. And I just want to hear you respond to it, because I feel like this describes Roar pretty well. You said back in the day, quote, "All of my work is interested in merging opposites and extremity." And that really cut through for me because of the nature of Roger Orr as a character, the life story that you're telling here, and maybe Hollywood in general, high and low culture, artistic ambition versus corporate capitalism, failure and success, all of these themes that are kind of run throughout your work. But do you feel like you agree with yourself?
Yeah, I do. The theater that I work in, the stage, I should say, are opposites: fame and anonymity, enormous wealth and poverty, physical prowess and physical disability. These are the things that are stimulating to me, because the universe is essentially, for me, constructed in that, the masculine, the feminine. I know that may sound controversial at this point, And speaking of which, Roger Orr, late in life, I established that Roger Orr never felt comfortable in a male body. And he has long had a fantasy of having gender identity surgery, and becomes a great friend of Jan Morris, who was the wonderful writer and one of the earliest and most well-known men who had trans feminine surgery. But Roger Orr somehow doesn't have the guts to do it, decides to do it in his mid to late 60s, and then decides to reverse it. And it wasn't, that's a nuance that will be overlooked, because he's always was spiritual, Roger, and he becomes more so as he approaches the end of his life, and is contemptuous of himself that he was so focused on gender, and he feels that he didn't make a mistake by having that surgery, but wants to reverse that surgery, and winds up partially doing that while letting the world think he fully reversed the surgery, because he wants to enter that world that the Buddhists call the third gender, that place that we are going where there is no gender. So he felt almost embarrassed that he'd been so consumed by this idea, which became a kind of socio-cultural, political football, in a sense, of exchanging one gender for another, when the reality was, at the end of his life, he wanted to have no gender at all.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is like, maximalism is a word that occurred to me as I was reading this book. Like, it's a really over-the-top life story, and yet there are moments at which I found myself like having to check myself and be like, okay, this isn't real. Like that it tricks you, and that's a testament to the writing and to the I don't know, to your cultural knowledge, which feels pretty vast to me.
Yeah,
but you talk about Roger Orr's, the extremes and the opposites, and his journey with gender, but he's also got this incredible origin story as the biological son of a famous Black singer and a Klansman, a KKK,
bigot. Who raped her in 1940. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, this guy, and then he goes on to become adopted by this wealthy family, but it's just it's an incredible story, and it almost is beyond belief, and yet I believed it.
Well, even to this day, there's hundreds of footnotes in this book, and when we were doing the audiobook, I can still look at those footnotes, and I have to think hard to know if they're actually referencing a real book or a real interview, or if they're completely made up. In the audiobook reading, we had actors. I had an actor tell me that they looked up the character they were reading on Wikipedia and didn't find them there, and that was just a signal for me that character was not real. I had a close friend of mine, and actually he wasn't the only one. Many people did not know that Ernest Hemingway had a trans feminine son, Gregory. And so they thought that was very good, the way I had done that. And of course, that was true. And many people thought that what I'd written about the actor Fred McMurray was true, that he was a junkie, a kind of legendary heroin addict. And that was invented. So the idea of, his mantra, Roger Orr's mantra throughout the book is all is illusion. And I really do feel that now, someone said a few years ago, maybe it was Graydon Carter, who's also a voice in the audiobook, his own voice, that irony was dead. I would now amend that to satire is dead. From what you were saying a moment ago, the maximalization of it. If you were to, years ago, talk about the Kardashians and suggest that Bruce Jenner, the Wheaties champion, the decathlon winner, was going to transition to become a woman, one would say that was farcical, that was maximalist, etc. And now, every day on the internet, there's examples of the unthinkable or the unwritable being prosaically true. So I had to really, the heart of my efforts were to write a novel that was traditional in a sense, except told through voices, like an epistolary novel is told through letters, but in its essence, a kind of old school novel that hopefully would move people in the way that people were moved by such creations, you know. I had to get out of the way of the kind of fireworks of parody and of satire. Those things took a back seat to the driver, which was hopefully for me a full-throated, fully dressed novel.
Well, there's a line from one of your past books, I believe it's The Chrysanthemum Palace, where you say Americans define time as the space within which one succeeds or fails. And this is definitely a book about pun intended, roaring success. Like Roger Orr is an incredibly accomplished human being, filmmaker, songwriter, poet. What am I missing? You know, there's so much.
Dermatologist,
novelist, yeah, dermatologist. You know, like he's just over the top success, and it really, this book, as the satirical aspects of this book that I appreciate so much and found so funny. A lot of it has to do with, I think, this just ingrained sense that we all have if we've been born into this country and paid even like a modicum of attention, is this cultural mythology around success and failure, and how much we love to lionize success stories in America. Like this book speaks to that so clearly, and it's just so recognizable. Like the ways in which like celebrity friends fawn over Roger and talk of his talent in these like magisterial terms, you know. There's more than an ounce of truth in that. And it was just so funny to see on the page. You did it so well.
Well, thank you. You do, I think perhaps more than anything I've written, this book taps into the ether, you know, for some reason. And it's in the fog of war. I can't remember very much about the building blocks of this book. But for some reason, Roger Orr is introduced to the actor Leslie Jordan, and they become lovers, which is completely improbable to the friends, until the friends get to see the two of them together. Leslie Jordan, for those who don't know, is died maybe 9 months ago. I can't remember, and was a kind of elfin queer from the South, and very funny, very dear, and a kind of TV star who acquired a huge following during lockdown and was much beloved. And I just, I don't know how I learned about him. He certainly wasn't on my radar. And then he actually ends the novel before the epilogue by talking about his husband who has just died. And then I got some emails from people saying they were so sorry to hear about the death of Leslie Jordan, you know. And I just was so touched by that, because I truly felt that Leslie Jordan was part of the family, you know,
right.
And they did too. And there was a kind of poetic beauty to those events. Certainly it was terrible, his death, but his death became part of the great fiction that our lives and deaths are. For me, it sounds narcissistic, but these are among the many sort of peculiar resonances and reverberations that happen when the writer gets out of the way. I've talked about that before, that writers, I feel, do their best work when they can disappear, and you disappear by this avoidance of self as you write. And if you've been doing it a while, your chances are either better or worse. Worse because you're enthralled by yourself at this point, but better because you have kind of a muscle memory. You know what you're doing sufficiently that, like a master woodworker, you can empty your head as you carve, you know. And something kind of very interesting happened to me. I underwent an identity theft after I'd written the book. When we were doing the audiobook, someone got a hold of everything about me and tried to take money out of one of my accounts and had my address, my social security number, everything. And that to me was a perfect metaphor for what happened with the book. I had been this precious self, you know, Bruce Wagner / author, was erased and up for grabs in the public domain, which is where I released my last book. I was now in the public domain, no copyrights, no legality, nothing. And that was interesting to me because I wanted, you know, the not my publisher, but the marketing people said they didn't want this book to say by Bruce Wagner. I mean, they wanted the book to say by Bruce Wagner. I wanted it to say compiled and edited by Bruce Wagner. And finally, I got my way because Tony Lyons, our fearless publisher, who's an attorney as well, said, no. Because these are marketing people go by whims and trends, and by compiled and edited by Bruce Wagner will confuse people, all this kind of nonsense. So I was effectively erased from, by definition, because this book no longer said by Bruce Wagner. It said compiled and edited by. And another irony is that Sam Wasson, who's the great Hollywood historian and essayist on film, who was coming out with the oral history of Hollywood at the same time as this book. Sam is in my book and in New York recorded his voice for the audiobook and interviewed me a few days after he'd been interviewed by the wonderful director. His name escapes me now, as it shouldn't, for his oral history. And then my former book editor, who had published 10 of my 13 novels, 10 of them, he was responsible for the compiling and editing the Paul Newman memoir that just came out. So,
and who is this? Who is this editor?
David Rosenthal. So there was Hollywood and Oral History compiled and edited by Janine Basinger and Sam Wasson. Paul Newman's memoir compiled and edited by David Rosenthal, and then Roar, American Master, compiled and edited by myself, you know. So it's these are just the strange little things that pop up when you're in the ether, you know.
Well, there's the satirical element to the book, and the great way that you're kind of lampooning our cultural mythology, especially entertainment culture here in Hollywood. But there's also, to me, more than a whiff of elegy in this book. Not only the elegy for Roar and his life that has passed, but maybe a little bit of an elegy for an era in Hollywood that is gone, like the golden age of Hollywood. He really is emblematic of so much of that. Like the story that you're telling of his life seems in a way kind of unrecognizable in a contemporary Hollywood context. It seems like something that, you know, used to happen and maybe can't anymore.
Yeah, he's certainly a towering figure along the lines of of Orson Welles, closer to Welles than he is to Mike Nichols, even though he began his career as a brilliant stand-up comedian, Roger Orr, releasing these basement tapes that he did when he was 14 years old.
Right.
Quite a genius in that regard. But yeah, I mean, oral histories by definition, I suppose, you need to have a long life, which gratefully covers far more territory than this hellish moment we're living in, where there is this Stalinist fervor to destroy, to punish, to erase, to cancel. And I cover that too. Roger Orr writes a play. He's probably in his 70s now, called The Cancel Ward, which is drawn from Solzhenitsyn's The Cancer Ward. And I don't have much phantom nostalgia for periods of time that I didn't somehow embody. The 40s. I was born in 54 and really came of age in the 60s. But as you had described, this book really goes from the mid-20s, but mostly starts in 1940. And I covered as much ground as I could using my own predilections and interests and fascinations and intrigues. And that part was fun for me. It was very much fun. But it does cover so many eras that have appeal, and this era is not without its appeal for me as well. But I'm glad Roger died in 2018.
before things really got dark.
Yeah.
So I want to shift a little bit and talk about your history in this city. This is the place where you came up. You know it very well. I think the early book, especially, you've had some comparisons made to Nathaniel West, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and his Pat Hobby stories. But I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit about your personal biography, like growing up in Beverly Hills and dropping out of high school, right? I think I have that right.
Yeah. We moved to Beverly Hills when I think I was 8 years old, and I went to school with, kids would come at the after lunchtime, still wearing the costumes that they worn for co-starring in Bonanza. You know what I mean? A television show back in the day. I went to school with Liz Taylor's kids. We lived practically next door to Broderick Crawford. We lived on the south side of Wilshire, which are the so-called slums of Beverly Hills. But there was, Dean Martin's son, Dino, would race by in a Ferrari while I'm in elementary school lunchtime, because those kids went to a school called Rexford, which was a private school for very wealthy kids and kids that were having a lot of difficulties, right? And Beverly Hills back then was very much a small kind of Norman Rockwell town. There was a J.J. Newberry's where you could have a milkshake. There were a little magic shop. There was a place called Entrees, which was one of those automated cafeterias. There were the only place that survived all this is, I think, Nate and Al's. The delicatessen is still there. There's hardly anything that's still there. And I then went to Beverly, and I kind of peaked in 8th grade. I was very popular.
So did I.
Oh, there you go.
I've said that before. I'm like, it was all downhill after 8th grade.
Yeah, it was all downhill. All of my friends were very wealthy. You know, no one ever came to my house because it was like a shitty little apartment in my head. But you'd go to their homes for sleepovers and their parents wouldn't be there. You'd be swimming at night and a servant would bring out trays of food. I mean, this was like de rigueur. And I became more and more disaffected and disconnected in high school and dropped out in my junior year, worked in bookstores in Century City. This was back when there were 3 bookstores in Beverly Hills. 3, count them. There was Hunter's, Martindale's, and Brentano's. And I worked at both of those, but I worked in Century City at Martindale's, and kids would come in from school and recognize me, and it would be a cognitive dissonance, like, is this a prank? Why are you here? And then I worked for the 2 main jobs I had. Is the first one at 18 is I drove an ambulance at Schaefer Ambulance over on Western and Beverly Boulevard. And I did that for a year and a half. And then I drove a limousine at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And I did that for a few years. Both of those jobs were fantastic, you know, and both were the extremities we're talking about. And toward the end, there didn't seem to be much of a difference between driving a limousine and driving an ambulance for me. But I did, you know, I would drive catatonic women up to Camarillo. I would go to emergency rooms to transport people that had just shot themselves in the head to the neurological unit at the County General. And with the limousines, I would drive Audrey Hepburn, Olivia de Havilland. I would drive boxing promoters to South Central and go to speakeasies with them. Lou Rawls's mother, I think, had a speakeasy, and I would be the only white person, the driver, treated very well, at an after-hours club called Mr. Mitch's Another World. You know, I mean, so I I broke free from that model, the Beverly Hills model, which was everyone went to college without fail. And I never returned to school. So I do have somewhat of a nostalgia for that time. Some of my close friends had the same experience that I did going to those schools. Gavin DeBecker's one of them, who was a childhood friend of my dear friend Carrie Fisher, Morgan Mason, James Mason's son. A lot of people that shared the same experience that I did.
Wait, how did you know Carrie Fisher?
Carrie Fisher, I'm not sure how I met Carrie, but we became very, very close. And Gavin and I officiated at her daughter Billy's wedding last year in Mexico. And we wrote the vows. I mean, it was just a beautiful, one of the most beautiful things that's ever happened to me, and Gavin as well.
Wow, that's great. I didn't realize she was great. I think everybody universally loves Carrie Fisher.
Yeah.
You know, she was special. So when it comes to fame, having grown up in this mix and known a lot of these people or driven them around or whatever it is, what have you learned about it? Having witnessed it at close range, like what have you learned about fame?
Well, like anything else, it can become an addiction if one doesn't at least make an effort to erase the self. I was just reading a beautiful Sufi story about a man who collapses in the section of a city where there are perfume makers. So people rush up to him and put various different perfumes under his nose, and nothing rouses him until another man appears with a filthy rag and puts it under his nose, and he awakens. And the man that with the filthy rag says that you must prepare yourself for the next dimension, meaning death, or what we call death. And he said, if you are attached to the familiar smells, the familiar sights and sounds and smells of this world, you're going to have a much more difficult time, you know. So the idea that you know, in Buddhism, they do say that everything is impermanent, even the gods. But the fall or the death of gods, interestingly enough, begins with a foul odor that they begin to emanate, that the other gods notice and start to keep their distance. And the fall is so profoundly agonizing because it was something that that they had forgotten would happen to them. They'd been alive for so long. So I think fame, you know, another Buddhist story that I have talked about before, there was a hermit whose obsession was that he become the most famous cave hermit in the history of Buddhism. And the Buddhists have said or written that fame is a disease or a handicap. The lust for fame, the need for fame and attention, than even poverty or disease or physical disease. So it's very difficult to erase the self, you know, or to even have the notion that erasing the self will provide some kind of transcendence. But for you know, Roger Orr, really, I share this belief with him, felt that all is an illusion. So great wealth and great poverty are just different sides of the illusion coin. And fame and anonymity are the different sides of the illusion coin. In other words, there will come a time when one hopefully understands that fame means nothing and is not helpful in any way unless the self is erased. Then it becomes something that you can have fun with. But you can't have fun with something that is riding your back, you know, with its claws sunk in deep.
So to get to your like creative trajectory, you're driving an ambulance, you're driving a limousine, you're working in bookstores, and then you get to, like, how do you get to writing a book?
Well, you had mentioned, you know, I'd always written. From 11 years old, I was doing imitations of O. Henry stories or Bret Hart, who I loved. Maybe I liked Ray Bradbury as well, you know, as a young boy. And I was having a lot of issues of fear that I would never be able to write a novel. You know, I was stealing books, you know, by the armful from the bookstores, and I had a beautiful little library, and I was in agony because I thought, this is impossible. So I wrote short stories and wasn't entirely satisfied with them. And then I read some of Kafka's prose poems, and I was shocked that Kafka had written prose poems because I was, of course, familiar with his stories, but I was so focused on novels that I just considered Kafka to be a novelist, something that it was impossible for me to affect. But something about the prose poems that he didn't care where they were going. That just opened a door for me, and I began to do stories, and then Pat Hobby stories by Fitzgerald were so interesting to me because they were so funny and so bleak, so dark, and yet hilarious, and even more moving to me that many were published posthumously, in I think Esquire, because he was forgotten and struggling at that point. So I wanted to write my version of the Pat Hobby stories, but bring them much further than Fitzgerald's time would have allowed, and perhaps Fitzgerald's inclinations. My stories end in pedophilia and disfigurement, and so I wrote Force Majeure, the Bud Wiggins stories, instead of the Pat Hobby stories. And I think literally I had typed them and sent them around to friends, and I got a wonderful response from them. And a friend of mine, Cotty Chubb, said that he would do a desktop publication of those stories, which he did. And we sold them out of Book Soup. And I think we sold 1,000 of them out of Book Soup. And I got a book deal with Random House based on those. And it was to convert those short stories into a novel, and then I was off and running, But now I really do feel that I'm writing posthumously. My books are completely ignored at this point, and there's no self-pity in it at all for me. I got a tremendous amount of attention for my books early on, and the last book that I wrote, The Marvel Universe, was canceled because of, quote, problematic language, and I released it into the public domain. Just anyone can download it and print it out and change it, do whatever they like with it. And Roar, which is an apotheosis of my work, not a single review. And I'm saying this because it is all an illusion. It ties into what we've been talking about. For me to cry my eyes out that it is as it is as nuts as me jumping for joy at the wonderful review. You know what I mean? It all is a wash, and so it's something I'm observing now, and it's of note and of interest to me. I'm extremely grateful that I found Arcade, who's a kind of fearless publisher, Tony Lyons, and has a respect for my work, and gratified that I'm able to be published, regardless of sales and trends, And I'm not saying that I'm not reviewed because my books are problematic, etc. I think the books are ignored, so they're not. They don't even get to that point where someone objects to something. You know what I mean? And that's just just is. It has nothing to do with me, nothing to do with my work. It just is. There's no explaining of it. It's what Ramesh Balsekar, this Indian man of knowledge, said is a happening. It's nothing more than a happening. So that's part of the training to get the self out of the way. It can put a dent in your mood. This is the phrase Leonard Cohen used when he found out that he'd been, his personal manager had stolen millions of dollars from him. But if it does more than put a dent in your mood, then you've got to do something about that, because all is illusion, and fame, the great wealth, self-pity over lack of fame or great wealth, it is all a fantasy. It's all a fiction. So in that way, like Svetlana Alexievich being awarded the Nobel for Literature, everything merges, and so that's where I'm at now, moving through this life with as much equanimity as I can find. And you find that equanimity by getting out of the way, not putting so much emphasis on identity. Bruce Wagner, Hollywood writer, Hollywood satirist. Bruce Wagner, formerly acclaimed. Bruce Wagner, now ignored. These are all constructs, and they all come from self and vanity and ego. So you simply do your best work, whatever that work is. I can wash dishes and have the same satisfaction that I have when I'm in the middle of writing a paragraph, because the self is gone. So with the self gone, there's no goal line. There's no race to win, and that's where you find peace.
Okay, so the things that you're talking about have a spiritual air to them, to me, and that's definitely something that your work, not just Roar, but all of your work, is suffused with. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of Buddhish, is the way I put it. So I responded very much to a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about in this conversation, but also in your books. And I'm curious to know a little bit about that part of your life. I feel like Los Angeles, maybe one of the things that I like about it so much is that amid the great mess of it, I've lived here 20 years, so I'm from the Midwest, but have made this my home. But one of the things that maybe it doesn't get as much credit for as a virtue is the fact that it is a kind of spiritual laboratory. It's a wide open place in a lot of respects, at least from my perspective, coming from a more cloistered maybe environment. We're both from Wisconsin originally. I realize you're from.
Yes, you're Milwaukee, right?
Yeah. So, it's more of like a Catholic, narrow, square, by comparison, Los Angeles feels like a place where you can really experiment in that regard. And I'm just wondering what your path has been like in that respect.
I spent about 10 years with Carlos Castaneda, and he would always say that energetically, the Valley of Los Angeles is very similar to the Valley of Mexico. So it's no mistake to me, all the jokes aside about Los Angeles being a potpourri of New Age bullshit, that Leonard Cohen winds up here, that Carlos Castaneda lived much of his life here. These things all make sense to me. So for me, I think perhaps with my obsession about writing about the very worst parts of myself and humanity, to this endless confrontation in my work with what we are capable of, the horrors and the sacred, and the self is the architect of our destruction. So I think I was possessed with understanding more about that, and how can I erase or minimalize self, at least give it a small s, and how would that affect my life? And so these aspirations one has to erase the self, you'll be doing that. I'll be doing that on my deathbed and failing. But there's something glorious about that too, because for me, failure has always been, there's the image of those who are on their knees in a cathedral, right? And it's that divine kind of acquiescence to the unknown that that we consider failure. The culture considers failure. the culture doesn't understand the word acquiescence. They equate it with passivity or masochism in a way, because this culture is about winning, So, so for me, humility is the thing that has captivated me. How out of reach it is for humankind, and only seemingly available in times of near fatality or the death experience. But even so, I've known people that have been had horrific things happen to them, and it didn't humble them at all. It almost inflamed the self, But I digress.
Just so I my listeners can get a sense of trajectory, like you're raised Jewish, correct? You had a bar mitzvah, I think I read about.
I did, but it was very Beverly Hills Jewish. We were, you'd be fancy bar mitzvahs, hand delivered invitations, scrawled on miniature Torahs, and then my bar mitzvah was at the Friars Club, and Tina Louise from Gilligan's Island was one of the guests. And we had a Christmas tree. That's how Jewish we were.
So how do you get from there to like hanging with Carlos Castaneda and having this Buddhist education?
I don't know if you'd call it hanging with. I just go. I don't consider myself a Buddhist at all. I just go to the things that interest me. Take what you like and leave the rest. So anything with a heart, Castaneda talked about this, the path with heart, it's a famous quote of his. You select the path with heart, but what is not included usually in the replication of that quote is all paths lead nowhere, because people interpret that as being nihilistic. The human being, the mind is insane. So what he was saying is all illusion. So you go with the path of heart. You can say that the all is illusion, but that one of those paths has a heart is a great illusion. So I always want to go with the great illusion.
So what do you see for yourself creatively going forward, or do you have a vision of what you have yet to accomplish?
I'm, I have 2 books that I'm going to be working on for the same publisher. One is called The Met Ball. It's going to be an oral history of a woman that gets disinvited from Anna Wintour's Met Ball and decides to have one on the West Coast on the same night as the one on the East Coast. And then I'm going to do a book very close to the Sufi tales and the supernatural Japanese tales of Lafcadio Hearn. So that will be a kind of Sufi stories that take place in Hollywood. Those are what I'm working on. There was an adaptation of a book I wrote called I Met Someone that was directed by Mike Figgis that might come out next year. But all in all, I'm like everyone else, at this point. What we wake up to is of great interest, in that will we this identity theft that happened to me is, I think, a kind of pandemic now. I don't mean the literal identity theft, but in a sense, which I think is a wonderful thing, everything that we expected, that we would have a long and happy, secure life, is being challenged, moment by moment. Not just through cancel culture, no, but through, the potential that digital currency will arrive and we will have nothing at all, or we will easily be robbed of whatever we thought we had, of events, COVID events, but on a much worse scale, etc. So I think that the best of the worst times is the status quo is being completely demolished. And I'm all for that. So I don't really feel that this is the darkest of times. I feel the darkest of times are there always. And sometimes they're just not, they're not illuminated, So now there's a spotlight on the darkness. And I think it's a good thing.
Well, last thing I want to say, like kind of a random aside, is that you had a cameo in one of these movies from my youth that was huge for me. And as I was researching, the One Crazy Summer. Yeah. That movie, is it Savage Steve Holland? Is that who directed it?
Yeah.
Okay. So like Better Off Dead, One Crazy Summer, the kind of John Cusack, constellation, and John Cusack who stars in Maps to the Stars. Your film with David Cronenberg. But anyway, just one of those movies I watched a million times as a kid on TV. And as I was researching, I read that you had a cameo in it, and it suddenly clicked. And I almost jumped out of my seat. I was like, oh my God, that he was the guy listening to the radio in One Crazy Summer. Just like so crazy. How did that even happen?
Another lifetime. I'm not sure if I had written one of the Nightmare on Elm Streets yet. I don't know. I needed money. And of course, I worked that into my Bud Wiggins stories, I think Force Majeure. I'm having a hard time remembering. And I ultimately, I had to have them write me out. I was having kind of a nervous breakdown. One of those movies we were shooting in Vancouver. The radio one might have been shot on the East Coast.
It's like Nantucket or something, right?
Yeah. But I don't, I was making, you got good money for this sort of stuff for me back then, but I was losing my mind, it was just, it was awful,
but maybe useful for the role because that character seemed to be hanging on by a thread.
No,
right?
no, it wasn't. It was all what my performance was, I think of, the Blue Angel, where the professor goes mad. It was just so embarrassing, and I was on autopilot. I wasn't drawing. It wasn't method acting. You know what I mean? And so but I used to think, oh, this is so embarrassing, and now at this age that I'm at, I'm happy it was memorialized. Because it just doesn't mean anything, and it's not a time I remember very well. But I'm glad you enjoyed.
Yeah, no, I mean, I loved it. To me, you're part of my little personal, movie history or something. For some reason, those movies were really sticky for me. And I gotta say, in closing, that prepping for this conversation distinguished itself. I've done hundreds of these, but reading about you and the life that you've lived, or the lives that you lived, you've led an interesting life. I don't know if you see it that way. Do you see it that way?
I don't, because I see my life through my books, that I have only existed through my books. That's how I see it. I know that is, I'm not sticking to that story. Do you know what I mean? But, and I do understand what you are saying. Others have said that to me, but I've met people that have led, to me, far more interesting lives. And my life has been completely in my head and is becoming more and more that way. So that's how I see it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of solitude and obsessive craft work. And certain aspirations toward the sacred. That's how I see it.
Now you're making me think of another thing I meant to ask you, and so I'm going to do it while I have you, is that in addition to having the sense of, wow, this guy's led a really interesting life and has found a way to materialize it in his books and mythologize it, is that you really seem to have a kind of steel trap memory and like a pretty vast cultural knowledge. It's definitely in evidence in Roar. Like there's so many references and Easter eggs. I probably missed half of them, but there's a lot in the book. And I would see some of them and be like, wow, okay. So he's there and, he's kind of making allusions to a lot of different things, like the myth of Tiresias and, all this different stuff. And I'm curious to know a little bit about your media and literary diet, and how much research you had to do, or if all this stuff was just kind of accumulated and was there. But like, what is Bruce Wagner's like reading life look like? What does your media diet look like?
I have a kind of disorder when it comes to reading. I don't read very quickly or very well. So now I tend to focus on books that are fueling or funding my next work. So I'm rereading Lafcadio Hearn. I'm rereading Sufi Tales. I'm reading, I have certain books that give me great comfort. One of them is Rudyard Kipling's book, Kim. So there's certain books I keep almost as talisman nearby. My diet in terms of film, I can go from tentpole blockbuster movies that I enjoy and help me turn my head off. I saw Tar recently, so I will see art films, but it is really shrunken. I certainly, when I watch television, I watch Deadliest Catch, the Crab Fisher show. I watch Shark Tank. I'll watch old movies, which are always glorious. But all in all, I really spend most of my time staring into space, and in that fluish period where before one actually writes that first sentence or paragraph. You're familiar with this, I know. I play video games, the casino, they don't involve money. I can literally do that 7 hours a day. I'm just a kind of drooling, empty person a lot of the time. And yet something's coming. You have that sense. Something's coming, and we know that it is, so that's, in terms of the book, I reached out internet and of course used my own knowledge and personal experiences, but you find strange, happy coincidences in the details of a person's biography, things that you had almost presaged in your thoughts and in the book itself that turn out to be true, or variations of what you've written. All is illusion, so you're creating things that are already are, and then things happen in the real world that are extensions of things you've written about before. So it's one hand washes the other,
Well, I've really enjoyed talking with you. I was very impressed with this book. I also laughed out loud a lot while reading it, which is
very happy about that.
Yeah, it is truly hilarious what you do here. Have you ever gotten into trouble with celebrities who you depict fictionally in one of your books? Has anybody ever taken umbrage that you know about?
Once someone took umbrage over something I'd written about a friend. The friend himself never said anything to me. this is Stephen Fry again, recently said that the only thing worse than being a character in a Bruce Wagner novel is not being a character in a Bruce Wagner novel. Very generous of him and kind, but I generally don't go after celebrities. I mean, Michael Douglas, when he had cancer, I wrote extensively about him in Dead Stars with, I thought, kindness. Same thing with Caitlyn Jenner. I'm just, it's that to me is pointless. You know, if I'm going to write about someone real, then I want to write about that person in a way that that is moving to at least to me, if not the reader. I have no it doesn't interest me at all to do a send up, you know, or an exaggeration of a real person. You know, it just wouldn't occur to me, and it's rather hateful, you know. So I really haven't had too much of that, you know. I remember one of my books, I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was not Laura Linney, but who's the Laura that was in David Lynch's?
Laura Dern.
Yeah, maybe it was Laura Dern. I had one scene where she was seeing a shrink. Someone was seeing a shrink and waiting to see their shrink. She steps out. And the lawyers in New York said, you can't imply that Laura Dern was seeing a shrink, even though she's written about it or talked about it in interviews, because the publishing rules in New York, this is 30 years ago, are such that you can't imply that a real person has issues with their psychiatric, just madness. And it may not have even been Laura Dern, I should say that now, but little tiny things like that. But I've never had an issue with that. You know, no one's ever sued me. I wish they would.
Be great publicity, right?
It would be publicity.
That's right. That's right.
Which is something that's foreign to me now.
Well, you and me both. I could talk to you all day. I mean, there's a lot to get to. We covered at least some of it, and I just congratulate you on this book, and I appreciate the opportunity to take up some of your time and pick your brain, and I wish you well on the next two books. Well,
I feel the same with you. I'm grateful and give a shout out to Jerry Stahl for having told me what a wonderful time he had with you. And I hope we meet.
Yeah, I mean, we're both here, you know, so hopefully one day we get to cross paths. I've been trying to get Jerry out for coffee, so maybe we could do something and get together and hang out.
I'm down.
All right, Bruce, thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Brad. Really appreciate it.